The most rigorous AI benchmark in biology right now isn't being run by a university, a pharma company, or a genomics institute. It was built by a company whose core business is a chatbot. That tension between who made this and what it's measuring is actually the most important thing about GeneBench-Pro. Here's what the headlines missed. When OpenAI published GeneBench-Pro, most coverage treated it as a capability announcement. Look how well our model scores on biology. But the benchmark itself, and especially the case studies attached to it, are telling a different story about where the real bottlenecks in AI-assisted biology actually live. Let's actually look at this. GeneBench-Pro is a benchmark suite designed to evaluate AI performance on professional-grade genomics and molecular biology tasks. Things like variant interpretation, gene expression analysis, protein function prediction, and literature synthesis across highly specialized domains. The surface story is straightforward. OpenAI built a hard benchmark, their models score well on it, and the case studies show real researchers using these tools to accelerate their work. That's the press release version. It's not wrong, it's just incomplete. What makes GeneBench-Pro structurally different from prior biology benchmarks is that it was built from real task workflows, not cleaned-up textbook problems. The tasks mirror what a postdoc or a computational biologist actually spends their day doing, which sounds obvious but is genuinely rare in benchmark design. Most AI benchmarks in science optimize for something that looks like expertise. Can the model answer hard, multiple-choice questions from licensing exams, or reproduce published results? GeneBench-Pro is instead asking whether the model can do useful work inside a real research pipeline. That is a much higher bar. The case studies OpenAI published alongside the benchmark are where things get genuinely interesting. They cover a range of institutions and use cases, from rare disease variant interpretation to literature-assisted hypothesis generation. But look at the pattern of where AI is adding value and where researchers are still doing the heavy lifting themselves. In almost every case study, the AI is handling what you might call the synthesis and retrieval layer, pulling together dispersed information, flagging relevant prior work, generating structured summaries of complex data. The judgment calls, the experimental design, the interpretation of ambiguous results. Those remain firmly with the human researcher. This is not a criticism. It's actually a more honest picture of what AI can do in high-stakes science right now than most vendors are willing to publish. The fact that OpenAI chose to show the boundary rather than obscure it is itself worth noting. Here's what the benchmark design reveals about OpenAI's strategic positioning. By building a benchmark in genomics specifically, not general biology, not chemistry, not radiology, they're staking a claim in a domain where data is structured, tasks are well-defined, and the value of getting things right is enormous. Genomics is a domain where AI can actually be evaluated rigorously. Compare this to something like medical imaging or clinical decision support, where ground truth is messier and regulatory pathways are complex. Genomics gives you cleaner evaluation surfaces. That's not an accident. It's a deliberate choice about where to build credibility first. There's also a competitive signal embedded in this release. DeepMind has AlphaFold. NVIDIA has partnerships across the drug discovery stack. Google has published extensively in genomic foundation models. OpenAI, until recently, had very little published presence in life sciences tooling. GeneBench-Pro is partly a credentialing move, but credentialing through benchmark ownership has a specific dynamic. Whoever sets the benchmark also shapes what counts as progress. If GeneBench-Pro becomes a standard evaluation suite in the field, OpenAI gets to define what good looks like for AI and genomics. That's a meaningful form of influence that doesn't show up in model capability scores. Let's actually look at what the benchmark doesn't cover, because that's equally informative. GeneBench-Pro doesn't appear to include tasks around experimental design, lab automation integration, or multimodal reasoning across imaging and genomic data simultaneously. Those gaps are probably intentional. They're areas where current models genuinely underperform. There's also the question of how GeneBench-Pro handles uncertainty. In clinical genomics, a model saying the wrong thing confidently is worse than saying nothing. How the benchmark penalizes overconfident wrong answers versus appropriately hedged responses is a design choice that will determine how useful the resulting models actually are in practice. The implications here cut across several groups. For biotech founders and drug discovery teams, GeneBench-Pro gives you a more grounded framework for evaluating AI vendor claims. If a vendor can't speak to how their system performs on task-native benchmarks like this one, that's a meaningful signal about how seriously to take their capability pitches. For AI researchers building in the life sciences, the structural choice to anchor on real workflows rather than curated test sets is a methodology worth studying. The benchmark as research artifact is as interesting as whatever model happens to top it today. And for the broader AI field, GeneBench-Pro is another data point in a pattern we've been tracking. The frontier labs are no longer content to let third parties define how their models are evaluated in high-stakes domains. They're building the measurement infrastructure themselves. That's a power shift worth watching. What to watch next? Whether GeneBench-Pro gets adopted by independent labs and academic groups as a standard, or whether it stays as an open AI internal validation tool. The difference between those two outcomes will tell you a lot about whether this is a genuine scientific contribution or a sophisticated marketing artifact. Both can coexist, by the way. Also watch for how competing foundation model developers, particularly those with deeper biology-specific training data, respond. A benchmark is only as useful as the models competing on it, and right now, we're still in the early innings of understanding what biological reasoning actually requires at a model architecture level. GeneBench-Pro is not the moment AI cracks biology. It's something more incremental and arguably more important, a serious attempt to measure what's actually working, built by a team with enough resources to do it rigorously. In a field full of overclaimed demos, that's a better starting point than it sounds.